Subscribe now, the next story we uncover might be about you. A community of over 9,000 people, tucked into the hill country of India's northeast, was formally recognized by Israel's own religious establishment as descendants of a tribe scattered 27 centuries ago. That recognition came from the Sephardi chief rabbinate itself, under Rabbi Shlomo Amar, in 2005. Not a folk claim, not an internet theory, but an actual religious legal ruling with the weight of a state behind it. Thousands of families had already begun packing their lives into suitcases before that ruling ever landed. And then, years later, when genome-wide ancestry testing finally caught up to the belief, the results did not confirm what the ruling implied. They call themselves Bnei Menashe, children of Manasseh, and their DNA does not carry the signature that a Middle Eastern ancestral claim would require. Not faintly, not partially obscured by time. The signal simply isn't the one anyone expected to find. Here is the detail nobody says out loud when they tell this story. An entire population relocated across 4,000 kilometers, converted under Orthodox law, resettled in Israeli towns and settlements, years before the genetic question was ever seriously tested. If their DNA doesn't say Middle East, what exactly does it say? And why did a nation act on faith before it ever checked the evidence? Long before any genetic laboratory existed, the Bnei Menashe had already answered the question of who they were, and they'd been answering it for the better part of a century. To understand how deep that answer runs, you have to start with who they were before the story of Israelite descent ever entered their world. The Kuki-Chin-Mizo peoples of Mizoram and Manipur are a Tibeto-Burman-speaking population, historically animist, living across the terraced, monsoon-soaked hills that straddle India's border with Myanmar. Their spiritual and social life prior to the 19th century had nothing to do with the Hebrew Bible. That changed with contact, specifically with the arrival of Welsh Presbyterian and Baptist missionaries who began evangelizing the Lushai Hills starting in 1894. Christianity took root fast and deep. Today, by some estimates, over 87% of Mizoram identifies as Christian, one of the highest concentrations of any region in Asia. It was against that backdrop in the 1950s that a local religious leader named Mela Chala began teaching something new, that the Kuki-Chin-Mizo peoples were not simply converts to a foreign faith, but descendants of Israelites exiled from the northern kingdom after the Assyrian conquest of 722 BCE. The claim wasn't presented as metaphor, it was presented as memory, long buried, finally recovered. Adherents pointed to specific cultural evidence they said predated any missionary influence. Certain ritual songs, animal sacrifice practices, a clan-based social structure that believers said echoed the 12-tribe partition described in the Hebrew scriptures. Whether those practices were genuinely ancient or reconstructed after the fact became, and remains, one of the quietest and most consequential questions in this entire story. The claim did not stay a local curiosity. An Israeli organization called Shavei Israel, founded by Michael Freund, took up the cause in the early 2000s, facilitating the emigration of thousands of Bnei Menashe to Israel. Several thousand completed formal halachic conversion. Families that had spent generations in the hills of northeast India were resettled in Israeli towns and, in some cases, contested settlements. This is not a fringe belief practiced by a handful of eccentrics. It is a functioning, decades-old religious identity, held sincerely by tens of thousands of people, that has already reshaped citizenship, geography, and family history for real, living families. Every piece of that story, the missionary contact, the 1950s revelation, the ritual evidence, the rabbinic ruling, the mass emigration, is cultural, religious, and institutional. It is real in the way that law and belief and lived experience are real. But there is one category of evidence in this entire narrative that has never lined up cleanly with the rest of it. That category is the genome itself. Here is where it gets complicated. When population geneticists finally turned their instruments toward northeast India, the picture that came back was not ambiguous. Genome-wide studies of Tibeto-Burman-speaking populations in this region, the broader linguistic and genetic family the Bnei Menashe belong to, show overwhelming East and Southeast Asian genetic affinity. Not a mixed signal, not a partial West Eurasian trace buried under noise. A clear, dominant ancestral pattern that points toward East Asia, not the Fertile Crescent. This finding sits on top of one of the most well-established frameworks in Indian population genetics. The 2009 study published in Nature by geneticists David Reich, Kumarasamy Thangaraj, and Lalji Singh, which mapped the deep ancestral structure of the subcontinent into two major ancient populations, ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian lineages, whose mixture over thousands of years produced the genetic landscape of modern India. That same analytical toolkit is sensitive enough to detect Jewish ancestral signals elsewhere on the subcontinent with real clarity. It does not detect one here in anything like the strength the tradition would require. A haplogroup, if you're unfamiliar with the term, functions something like a surname passed down not on paper but inside the body itself. A genetic marker inherited largely unchanged along one parental line, generation after generation, that lets researchers trace deep ancestral branches the way a genealogist traces a family name. When earlier researchers went looking for a very specific surname in this population, a Y chromosome marker known as the Cohen modal haplotype, historically associated with the Jewish priestly line, the results were not the clean confirmation anyone hoped for. British anthropologist Tudor Parfitt of SOAS, University of London, conducted some of the most cited fieldwork testing Bnei Menashe men for this marker. The results were contested, inconclusive. Not the kind of finding you build a national policy on, and not the kind of finding that quietly disappears from the conversation either. It lingers, unresolved, exactly where believers hoped for certainty. This is the part the records don't explain. A comprehensive, peer-reviewed genome-wide dataset, isolating Bnei Menashe samples specifically, separate from the broader regional population data, remains a gap in the published literature. One researchers in this field openly acknowledge needs further direct study. What is well established, without dispute, is the broader regional ancestry pattern the Bnei Menashe sit inside. And that pattern reads almost identically to their Mizo and Kuki neighbors, people who share the same hills, the same recent history, the same missionary contact, and who make no claim to Israelite descent whatsoever. So a paradox sits at the center of this story, and it will not resolve cleanly. A community with a 70-year-old, government-recognized, rabbinically ratified Israelite identity. A genome that looks, by every available measure, like the genome of their neighbors who never made that claim at all. The one genetic thread believers point to directly, the priestly Y chromosome marker, was never as solid as the story built around it. If the genes don't come from the Middle East, the real question stops being whether this is an authentic lost tribe. It becomes something stranger. Why would a specific, detailed, internally consistent ancestral claim take root in this particular population, in this particular era, if the biology doesn't support it? The first explanation is the one most historians reach for, and it doesn't require a lost tribe at all. It says the Israelite identity was a 20th century religious innovation, not a hoax, but a genuine reinterpretation, shaped by direct exposure to the Old Testament's own narrative of exile and eventual restoration. A population that had just endured colonization, rapid religious conversion, and displacement from its own older belief systems found, in the biblical story of a scattered and returning people, a framework that mapped remarkably well onto its own recent history. The missionaries who arrived in 1894 didn't just bring Christianity. They brought an entire narrative architecture: exile, chosenness, eventual homecoming, and that architecture proved durable enough to outlast the specific denomination that introduced it. With 87% of Mizoram identifying as Christian today, the scale of that religious transformation is not in question. What is harder to explain under this theory is the ritual evidence believers cite as predating missionary contact altogether. Specific sacrificial practices and clan structures they insist existed before 1894, not after. A borrowed story can explain belief with real precision. It cannot, on its own, explain details that believers swear came first. Here the story stops being simple. The second theory takes those pre-Christian ritual details seriously, and in doing so, it drags in a much older, much messier historical migration. Kuki Chin Mizo oral tradition describes a long ancestral route from a place called Chinlong, moving through what is now Myanmar, unfolding over centuries before the population settled the hills of present-day Mizoram and Manipur. Some researchers argue that somewhere along migration and trade routes stretching across Central and South Asia, older ritual and religious concepts, sacrificial practice, purification codes, clan-based social organization, could have traveled through contact and trade without a single intermarriage ever occurring. Cultural transmission and genetic transmission are not the same thing. A practice can move through conversion, trade, or shared regional contact, and settle permanently into a population's ritual life, without leaving the faintest trace in that population's genome. It is entirely possible to inherit a ceremony, and not a single ancestor. But the timeline itself carries a problem researchers are careful to frame as probability, not certainty. Linguistic surveys place the most recent segment of Kuki Chin Mizo migration into the Mizoram Manipur region at roughly 300 to 500 years ago. a fraction, not a match, of the 27 centuries since the Assyrian exile the tradition claims as its origin point. 3 to 500 years. 2700. Not a rounding error, a gap measured not in years but in millennia. This theory is attractive precisely because it takes the ritual evidence seriously instead of dismissing it. But it remains largely unfalsifiable. There is no direct documentary record of the specific contact event it requires. Only inference stacked on inference. And even this theory assumes something that the next piece of evidence complicates directly, that the ritual similarities themselves are unusually specific, rather than strikingly common. Because several of the practices cited as distinctly Israelite, animal sacrifice, purification rites, clan-based social division, appear across dozens of unrelated tribal and indigenous religious systems worldwide, entirely independent of any Middle Eastern contact whatsoever. The data doesn't confirm ancient contact. It only fails to rule it out, and when a pattern shows up that often across that many unconnected cultures, the match starts to look less like inherited ancestry and more like the kind of ritual convergence anthropologists document again and again in societies with no historical link at all. There is a third possibility, and it's the one almost no academic will put their name to directly, though the evidence hasn't ruled it out either. It suggests the Lost Tribe framework functioned less as literal genealogy and more as an act of political and religious self-determination for a marginalized, historically stateless hill population. Formal recognition as Israelite descendants offered something no purely regional ethnic identity ever could: a legal path to Israeli citizenship, economic opportunity in a wealthier nation, and international religious legitimacy for a community that had spent generations on the margins of Indian national life. This is not an accusation of fabrication. Belief can be entirely sincere while still being shaped, quietly and without contradiction, by very real material incentive. Most researchers are hesitant to state it this bluntly, but the pattern itself, a marginalized population, sudden missionary contact, a new narrative offering both spiritual elevation and a literal escape route, followed rapidly by organized emigration, is one anthropologists have documented in other invented tradition cases around the world. Sincerity and strategic incentive are not opposites. They can sit inside the exact same human being at the exact same time. To understand how deeply this identity is now lived, not merely claimed, imagine standing inside a synagogue that shouldn't, by any conventional map of the world, exist. It sits in Churachandpur district, Manipur, or in a quiet corner of Aizawl, Mizoram, at an elevation of roughly 1,000 to 2,000 meters, surrounded by the terraced jom cultivation plots that define this monsoon-soaked hill terrain. Inside, the hymns are sung in Mizo, their melodies adapted from Hebrew liturgy learned secondhand, refined over decades by a community with no direct access to a native Hebrew-speaking teacher. Prayer shawls are worn layered over garments still recognizably tied to Northeast Indian tribal dress. Torah scrolls had to be imported from thousands of kilometers away, or in some cases hand-copied locally, because no established Jewish supply chain runs anywhere near these hills. Some congregants have spent over a decade on formal Israeli emigration waiting lists, continuing Orthodox observance in a region separated from Jerusalem by more than 4,000 kilometers of geography, a distance that underscores just how far this claim has had to travel to hold itself together. This is not a hypothetical identity crisis playing out in an academic paper. It is a lived, multi-generational, daily religious commitment, happening in a specific and verifiable place, carried by people who have staked real years of their lives on its truth. All of that devotion rests on a historical claim the genetic test was supposed to either confirm or quietly end. It did neither. And here is the detail that changes the shape of the entire mystery. The genetic test was never actually capable of answering the question everyone assumed it was asking. Israelite ancestry, as most people imagine it, a clean genetic signature, inherited unbroken across 27 centuries from a single ancient Middle Eastern population, is not how ancestry has ever actually worked for any Jewish diaspora community, including ones with far stronger, far less contested historical claims. Take the Cochin Jews and the Bnei Israel of Maharashtra, communities whose Jewish identity has never faced the kind of scrutiny the Bnei Menashe have. Genetic studies of both groups show heavily mixed ancestry, predominantly South Asian, with only a partial and variable Middle Eastern genetic component layered on top from a small founding population many centuries ago. If even long-established, widely accepted Indian Jewish communities carry ancestry that looks mostly South Asian and only partly Middle Eastern, then the entire premise underlying the Bnei Menashe genetic debate collapses in on itself. Clean, expected, and still wrong as a standard to measure anyone against. Here's the reframe the headlines never made. The 2005 recognition by Rabbi Shlomo Amar was a religious legal decision grounded in conversion and observance under Jewish law, not a genetic one. Nobody in that ruling was claiming DNA as evidence. The idea that a genome could later confirm or deny that ruling was a category error from the very start, one invented entirely by the way this story got told afterward, not by the ruling itself. The debate over Bnei Menashe genetics was never really a test of ancient history. It was a modern argument, disguised as an ancient one, over what being Jewish or being Israelite is even allowed to mean. Shared genes, shared practice, shared law, or simply shared self-recognition, sincerely held. This doesn't close the mystery. It reveals that the mystery was misidentified from the very first headline that ever used the word DNA next to the words Lost Tribe. One elder in Churachandpur, describing the emigration to a visiting researcher years ago, put it in terms that needed no scientific footnote at all. We did not need a test to tell us who we already knew we were. That sentence carries more of the actual weight of this story than any haplogroup frequency ever could. Which means the real unanswered question was never sitting inside the genome at all. It was sitting in what we decided ancestry was supposed to prove in the first place. Zoom out from the hills of Manipur and Mizoram, and this stops being one community's private mystery. It becomes a question sitting quietly underneath nearly every claim of ancient identity on Earth. Jewish, indigenous, tribal, national. Almost every population that claims deep, unbroken ancestral continuity carries some gap between what the genetic record actually shows and what the story built on top of it insists. Genomes are extraordinarily good at recording biological descent across centuries, with real, testable precision. But identity, religion, and belonging travel through an entirely different system: culture, law, ritual, and choice. One that moves faster than genes, further than genes, and far more selectively than genes ever could. Thousands of Bnei Menashe families have already built entire lives on top of this claim. Citizenship papers, marriages, children born as Israeli nationals, decades of Orthodox observance in Israeli towns. Genetics can neither fully confirm that life nor fully dismantle it. The test was asking the wrong instrument to measure the wrong thing. The DNA came back. And what it actually revealed wasn't a lost tribe found, and it wasn't a lost tribe disproven either. It was the far bigger, far less comfortable question underneath the headline itself. What was India's lost Jewish tribe ever really being asked to prove? And how many other peoples, right now, are still being measured with that same wrong instrument?